Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions and would ask if everyone here in-house would make the last-minute check that their cell phones have been turned off. It's always appreciated. Please do, David. It's especially appreciated on stage. One of these days, mine's going to ring when I say that, so don't set me up, please. Of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org, and we will post the program on our homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Hosting our program this morning and welcoming our special guest is David Azrod. Mr. Azrod serves as director of our B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics. Please join me in welcoming David.
Welcome, everyone. In the old regime in the French Revolution, Tocqueville observes that, quote, "It is quite understandable that when a nation is badly governed, it should develop a wish to govern itself. But," he continues, "a desire for independence of this kind, stemming as it does from a specific, removable cause, the evil practices of a despotic government, is bound to be short-lived. Once the circumstances giving rise to it have passed away, this desire for independence languishes, and what at first sight seemed a genuine love of liberty proves to have been merely hatred of a tyrant." How much wisdom is contained in this simple distinction between the love of liberty and the hatred of tyranny? Good, liberty-loving, free Americans that we are, we have often readily confused the two. During the Bush presidency, for example, some seem to think that inside of every Yemenite, Somali, Iraqi, and Pashtun, there was a little Tocquevillian Democrat waiting to burst forth. In his grandiose second inaugural address, President Bush went so far as to promise that the ultimate objective of American foreign policy would be, quote, "ending tyranny in our world," end quote. To this day, even after the fragile roots of the Arab Spring have withered and winter has set in, even after our difficult experiences with nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan, many still cling to the idea that, however difficult it may be to build a functioning democracy, deep down inside, that's what everybody wants. Islamic terrorists are not, according to this view, rejecting with contempt the goods that liberal democracy has to offer. They're simply expressing, rather, their frustration at not being able to secure them. But what if, as the affluent background of many of these terrorists suggests, not everybody yearns for liberty as we understand it? What if, following Tocqueville's lead, when we look at the struggles to topple tyrants abroad, we confuse the hatred of a particular tyrant with the genuine love of liberty? What if the choice in certain cases is not between tyranny and democracy, but between different kinds of tyranny? Not all tyrants, after all, aspire to the same things. Some long for honor and crass hedonistic pleasures. Others, more ambitious ones, aim to remake society and usher in a new world order, whether it be a caliphate, a Third Reich, or a communist utopia. Might we not then have to learn to differentiate between degrees and kinds of tyranny? To remind us of the permanent pertinence of tyranny, and to help us distinguish between garden-variety tyrannies that can be contained and moderated, and the millenarian zealous ones that cannot, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Waller Newell. I had the great fortune of spending 2 years at Carleton University in Ottawa studying political philosophy with Professor Newell. He's a brilliant professor who, unlike many brilliant professors, takes a keen interest in his students and spends much time with us outside of the classroom discussing politics and international affairs. He also writes on a broad range of topics, ranging from classical political philosophy to modern European literature to manliness. I would particularly draw your attention to a short piece he published in the wake of 9/11 in the Weekly Standard entitled "Postmodern Jihad, What Osama bin Laden Learned from the Left," in which he uncovers the Heideggerian roots of militant Islam. He's the author of several very well-regarded books, including his most recent one, Tyranny, a New Interpretation. If I may considerably simplify the book, he argues that Socrates' description of tyranny in Book 9 of the Republic cannot explain a Robespierre, a Stalin, a Hitler, or a Pol Pot, though it can account for an Assad or Hussein. He is currently at work on a follow-up volume that will form the basis of today's talk, in which he will discuss contemporary tyrannical regimes and the implications for American foreign policy. Please join me in welcoming Waller Newell.
Thank you, David, for that generous introduction. I'll try to live up to it. My thanks to the Heritage Foundation for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming out to hear about tyranny on a hot summer day. Alan Bloom had a favorite anecdote about World War II that he liked to tell, a true story about the von Stauffenberg plot. When the bomb went off, it seemed impossible that Hitler had survived, yet a few minutes later he came staggering forth. His hair was singed, his uniform had some burns, an eardrum was burst, but apart from that he was perfectly fine. And the first words that he uttered when he staggered out were a colloquial German expression that can be roughly translated as, "That's it, no more Mr. Nice Guy." This was July 1944. Alan was always convulsed when he told that story, and what it points to is that tyrants, because they are often outsized and grotesque personalities, are often a source of humor, from Chaplin's Little Dictator to Muammar Gaddafi's bodyguard of German Amazons, straight out of Pussy Galore and the Bond films. And of course, ridiculing tyrants is a powerful weapon in harming their mystique. But they are, of course, at bottom, frightening, cruel, and twisted personalities, monsters of aggression, aberrant passions, and a lust for prestige, the enemies of free government. They were first diagnosed by ancient Greek thinkers like Plato in the context of the very real struggle between democratic self-government at home and the threat of despotism, whether from within or without. And they are still with us today. As Freedom House recently reported, the forces of freedom in the world appear to be declining, while those of tyranny are arguably on the rise. Now, in my recent book, and more thoroughly in my upcoming one, I argue that there are three main types of tyranny that emerge from the history of the West, both in theory and in practice, and not only from the West. They're not absolutely distinct from one another, but they do stand out, I think, as separate types, as much as they may overlap. In talking about tyranny, I think a certain suspension of moral judgment is required at first, because tyranny is very much in the eye of the beholder. And it's unavoidably controversial, even for us to agree upon who is a tyrant and who isn't. This is fraught with controversy. But that suspension of moral judgment is only in order to acquire the information and insight to make a moral judgment about tyranny more informatively. So the first category is what I would call garden variety tyrants, at once the oldest and the most familiar from our world. These are basically men who dispose of an entire country and society as if it were their personal property, exploiting it for their own pleasure and profit, and to advance their own clan and cronies. As Aristotle put it, they rule as masters over a country as if it were their own private household. It's not inconceivable that such a ruler can benefit his country. He can be a vigorous leader in war and help expand the economy. But at the end of the day, it's all about his and his family's profit and pleasure. As the sophist Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic says, if the tyrant fattens up his flock of human sheep, it's only to make them more profitable for eventual slaughter. These tyrants often, although not always, descend into titanic excesses of hedonism and cruelty, since they are awash in purloined wealth and unrestrained by law. Examples from history of garden variety tyrants abound, ranging from Hero of Syracuse, Nero, the Somozas of Nicaragua, and until recently Mubarak of Egypt. The second type is what we might call the tyrant as reformer. These are men who are indeed driven to possess supreme honor and wealth and power unconstrained by law or democracy. But they are not mere hedonists or profit seekers. They really want to improve their society and people through the constructive exercise of their untrammeled authority. Examples arguably include Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, the emperors Napoleon I and III, and Kemal Ataturk. Whereas nobody in their right mind could have anything but moral contempt for garden variety tyrants like Nero, sots of greed and witless excess, reforming tyrants present a more complex challenge because they often attract large followings of admiring clients and subjects who sincerely believe they are doing what's best for the common good. Frequently, they are not perceived as tyrants, but as champions of the common people. Not only can they bring victory and independence to their peoples through war, but reforming tyrants embark on large-scale projects of public improvement in the realms of urban renewal, law, education, and closing the economic gap between the rich and poor. While hardly immune to honors and the camouflage of usurped legitimate titles, they want much more than to be a mere clan chieftain fattening himself off his subjects. They want nothing less than to impose order on a chaotic world for the benefit of mankind, with eternal fame as their reward, an impulse that emerged early on with world-aspiring tyrants like Nebuchadnezzar and the pharaohs of Egypt. In their personal lives, they are often ascetic, or at least restrained, employ violence for concrete aims rather than whimsical cruelty, and are often willing to endure the same hardships as their followers. But they are also capable of the excesses of the garden variety tyrant. A special category here would be modern state-building despots who follow Machiavelli's advice that outstanding princes can conquer fortuna and impose their will on nature to reshape it. The Tudors, Peter the Great, Louis XIV, Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great might be examples. Whereas feudalism had both divided and overlapping powers, the modern state, one might say, tries to concentrate all instruments of sovereignty in its own hands to create what Machiavelli called security and well-being for princes and peoples. This can take a republican path, but it can also take a despotic one, what was sometimes known as benevolent despotism. And I think that Machiavelli's own writings are torn between these two alternatives of the princely path as opposed to the republican path. I think on balance he prefers the republican path, but he's always open to the attractions of what power wielded by one efficient prince can achieve. Now, the third type of tyranny we might describe as millenarian. These rulers are neither content to be mere garden variety tyrants, gluttons, and exploiters, nor even to be reforming tyrants who make constructive improvements. The Machiavellian prince's exercise of will was largely meant to be pragmatic, restricted to building powerful states and commercial economies. But with Rousseau, I would argue, comes something new: political romanticism, the longing for an allegedly lost golden age of pure collectivism to be created through revolutionary violence, including class and racial enemies. The return to the year one was how the Jacobins put it. They are driven by the impulse to impose a millenarian blueprint that will bring about a society of the future in which the individual will be submerged in the collective and all privilege and alienation will forever be eradicated. Their league includes Robespierre, Stalin, Hitler, Chairman Mao, Pol Pot, and today's jihadists. The gruesome paradox of their revolution is that the coming world of perfect harmony of tomorrow will require prodigious excesses of mass murder, warfare, and genocide in the present. While garden variety and reforming tyrants have existed throughout human history from earliest times to the present, millenarian tyrants, I would argue, are strictly modern, with no precedents before the Jacobin Terror of 1793. Some see them as a secularized version of religious apocalypticism, comparable to the Cathars or Anabaptists, but I don't believe that this comparison really holds up. Millenarian tyrants certainly may do things for their countries that overlap with the reforming tyrant type. Stalin and Hitler both contributed to their respective countries' economic and technological modernization. And they are capable, behind closed doors, of some of the twisted excesses of the garden variety tyrant. Sometimes a decayed version of millenarian ideology becomes a justification for garden variety tyrants who claim to be reforming tyrants developing their countries. For example, the Ba'athist model based on the Soviet alternative for modernization from above. But at bottom, I would argue that the genuine millenarian tyrant has a goal that is beyond politics. They want to destroy today's world in order to bring about the nirvana of communism, the Thousand-Year Reich, the worldwide caliphate, or a somewhat limited case, Dugin's Eurasianism and its impact on Putin's foreign policy. I would say that Dugin isn't a believer in Eurasianism in the same way that Hitler was a believer in National Socialism or Ahmadinejad in a certain version of the Iranian Revolution. I don't think Putin would see himself and his country go down in flames in a kind of riverboat gamble the way Hitler did in order to bring about the Thousand-Year Reich. Nevertheless, having met Dugin and followed his writings over the years, I'm convinced that there's something more to Putin than a kind of 19th century militarist. I think there is a kind of millenarian flavor which, while he might not embrace it wholeheartedly himself, he does, in a certain sense, encourage it as a kind of Weltanschauung for his followers. Not least, by the way, in the extremist movements of Europe, which is, I think, an increasingly interesting thing to watch. Now, this debate about the varieties of tyranny is more relevant than ever, as the pursuit of freedom in our own world sometimes requires us to make some rather difficult and uncomfortable choices between the greater and lesser of evils. Does the replacement of a dictator by a self-professed democratic movement necessarily mean something better will come about? Or might a new kind of tyranny, even worse than what preceded it, be the long-term outcome? We should ponder how the French, Russian, and Iranian revolutions all began as reformist movements that were hijacked by collectivist extremists bent on genocide and war when we try to forecast a future for Egypt or Syria, or when we are tempted to throw over an imperfectly democratic authoritarian dictatorship when a totalitarian tyranny might be waiting in the wings to replace it. Again, might it be necessary to choose between relatively better and relatively worse non-democratic kinds of authority? Does the removal of tyranny itself guarantee that people will naturally become Democrats? Or might they want revenge against their former oppressors, thereby becoming oppressors themselves? These are not pleasant questions, but they are inescapable ones, as, for example, in the dilemma we face in trying to decide whether al-Sisi's coup was an improvement over Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood government. I happen to believe Morsi's government was a kind of legal Islamicizing coup in progress, and therefore I'm reluctantly bound to say that I do prefer the unfortunately non-democratic alternative of al-Sisi for now. And I realize that entails some very unfortunate complications. Now, the need for this discussion had been thought to be over within fairly recent memory because of the notion of the end of history. The conflict between free self-government and totalitarianism, it was thought, had ended with the defeat of the evil empire and what was to have been the spread of liberal democracy everywhere. Yet in reality, the world has become arguably more violent, less democratic, and less unified. The defeat of the Soviet Union's secular brand of tyrannical modernization from above opened a Pandora's box of repressed and barbarized tribal enmities, often under the color of religious faith. Jihadism, a new version of the revolutionary nihilism that began with the Jacobins, Bolsheviks, and National Socialists, fertilized with a concoction of Heidegger and Fanon, is the same drive to create through violence an austere collective in which every human being is an interchangeable integer with every other human being. We call them terrorists, a term I think long due for retirement from excessive overuse. But we should always remember that, just as with Robespierre, Lenin, and Hitler, terrorists are tyrants in waiting, and tyrannies continue to terrorize their own populations. In other words, history is not over because tyranny is back. Actually, it never left. And so, therefore, is the struggle between the free, self-governing republics of the West, with their heritage in classical Greece, and today's totalitarian threat. And that's why we need to entertain the same troubling choices as were forced on the West by its earlier struggles with Nazi and Bolshevik tyranny. The need to choose among the lesser of evils, or to not allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good. Should we undermine authoritarian dictators who, if not exactly allies, do not threaten us, when doing so might open the way to a totalitarian collective that is irredeemably hostile to the West, including its miner's canary in the region, Israel? We ought to remember Jeane Kirkpatrick's advice in this regard. Authoritarian dictatorships are capable of reform or improvement. Totalitarian tyrannies are not. Failing to understand this brought the Ayatollah Khomeini to power in 1979. Because we could not tolerate an imperfectly westernizing, non-democratic regime, we paved the way for the most dangerous regime in the world today. We face a similar set of choices in Syria and elsewhere right now. History is not over because tyranny is still with us, and so therefore is the need for the kind of prudent statesmanship that tries to recognize tyranny for the danger that it still poses, not least when it rears its head in the guise of a liberator or the tribune of justice for the common people. Thank you.
I'll let you field questions.
Yes, okay.
There's a mic that'll be circulating. Just introduce yourself and pose a question.
Hi, my name is David Baker.
Hello.
What does it mean for Fukuyama's thesis insofar as most tyrannies today dress themselves up in some sort of facade of democracy? You know, Saddam Hussein needed to be elected by 95%, Assad, Putin, etc. They call themselves the People's Democratic Republic, etc. What does that mean for Fukuyama's thesis today?
I suppose that he might say what it means is that regardless of the fits and starts in the spread of democracy, that the sole legitimacy of democracy is so overwhelming in today's world that even its worst distortions have to claim to it, have to lay some claim to it. In other words, there's no viable alternative in many cases to claiming to be a democratizer. Although one reason that Dugan interests me so much is because he has put together a compost of very dangerous ideas in an unusually compelling and coherent and even learned manner, which I think makes him a truly interesting figure in today's world, because he is a person who simply won't bother with these kind of half measures like, oh, we're a different path to democracy that takes account of our cultural differences. I mean, he simply wholesale rejects the very notion of Western-style democracy in a way that vividly, I think, recalls the folkish thinking of the 1930s, and not mistakenly, his great interest in Heidegger, who he has written a whole book about, has to do with this very notion, I think, of a kind of full-blown, what he calls the revolution of archaic values that is meant to be a whole new alternative. So I don't know what Francis Fukuyama would say about that. I'd be interested to know. But I think, apart from that case, he would probably maintain that in the long run, despite these fits and starts, that things are still going relatively well. Arthur?
Can you suggest why political science, as it's studied or as it's done in the academy, can't fully understand tyranny?
Yes, I'd love to. I am a political scientist myself, so this is an in-house critique, but I think that the notion that all forms of aberrant ambition, excessive honor-seeking, tyrannical honor-seeking, drive for prestige, are at bottom reducible to a misunderstood desire for material security, safety, and well-being, is an idée fixe that is so powerful. It reaches all the way back to Hobbes at least, and it really, I think, blinkers our capacity to see what is staring us in the face, because time and again we're told that the root cause of this kind of aggression is the frustrated hope for Western-style individualism and pluralism. However, I mean, David already mentioned the wealth of people like bin Laden, but we also, of course, have homegrown terrorists in the West now who have grown up in prosperous circumstances with lots of privileges, and it doesn't somehow dispel this burning conviction, this kind of moral contempt for what they see as the sloth and greed and materialistic degradation of the West. So I would say that political science needs to entertain the notion that tyrannical ambition is an independent variable in political behavior. I think a part of the problem goes back to Hobbes, because Hobbes is a fascinating figure to me. On the one hand, he gives a kind of very hard-headed, frank assessment of how certain kinds of people are driven by a desire for mastery over others. So you would say on the one hand, Hobbes is very realistic and hard-headed about human motivation, but ultimately that argument is for the sake of coming to the conclusion that these people can be enlightened as to the true basis of these misplaced longings for victory, and that they too can be brought on board. So in Hobbes, on the one hand, you've got this very frank and candid and realistic appraisal of human nature, but then it's for the sake of bringing about a world in which those people no longer have to exist. And I think that the social sciences are still sort of caught in the trammels of that contradiction. I mean, my colleagues would all be very much alive to self-interest as a motivation for idealism, but then at a certain point, they too would say, well, in the long run, though, you can enlighten people into giving up those drives and ambitions and bring them on board the Western project. Yes, sir? Did you?
Well, actually, I'm just curious as to your conversation with this fellow Dugan.
Yeah.
Who I now have to look up, but how did you
Yeah.
get along?
How did you get along with Dugan when you talked to him?
I happened to be invited to a dinner here in Washington when Dugan was actually brought here by the State Department to be debriefed about Russian affairs. It was during the Clinton era. And at that time, I think the full range of his hostility to the West was not quite known. It was thought that he was kind of like another Solzhenitsyn, and it would be useful to get his perspective. But when I met him, I found him actually very charismatic. His English was excellent. He was very soft-spoken, very persuasive. And I just started following his career, and he comes up again and again. I think the Breivik Manifesto, for example, has strong traces of Dugan's Eurasianism. And then, of course, more recently, with the patronage he has been given Putin, his influence over the Russian education system, the complete eradication of the glasnost and perestroika era, the recasting of the Soviet past as a kind of great Russian Bolshevism or national Bolshevism. I think his influence is really very powerful, and as I said, he is quite an intelligent person, and so. If one of the dangers of fascism is when the elite meets the gutter, I think Dugan is a person to watch because, he has a kind of coherent worldview, and I noticed that since the occupation of the Crimea, that more and more people are picking up on Dugan, and his ideas are starting to be broadcast more in the West, which I'm very glad to see. I think that's healthy that we know more about him.
Hi.
Yes, sir.
Ken Masugi.
Oh, hello.
Good to see you.
Good
yeah.
to see you. Yeah.
I'm going to throw out a very broad question. You began by distinguishing between the love of liberty and the hatred of tyranny. So I want to ask you, well, what has your study of tyranny told us about how we should better love and understand liberty? And I'm wondering whether the connection might be your work on manliness, whether there's tyrants seem to exhibit a type of manliness, perverse of course, and Americans seem to shrink from it. I mean, we're turning into last man and not real men and women.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think that I will argue in this new book that something like that traditional code of manly virtue, to the extent that we can recover it, is the best antidote to tyrannical nihilism in our own midst, because it frankly and fully accepts the temptation to aggressive honor-seeking and a desire for distinction through ambition, but hopes that that passion for preeminence can be sublimated and channeled into vigorous public spiritedness. So I think that, as Connor Cruz O'Brien once wrote, in order to understand the appeal of tyranny, you have to have a bit of a homeopathic inoculation of it yourself. You have to travel to the dark side a little bit, which means that you can't just read people like Locke. You do have to read Rousseau because you need to enter into that darker side a little and sort of go with it to an extent. And I think that's very true. And so I would hope that the earlier works I did on manliness might be sort of taken together with the recent interest on tyranny. It's all really of a piece because I also did this book on leadership a few years ago, and one of the things that fascinated me about great leadership was the sense in which the same qualities of ambition, aggressiveness, self-assertiveness that we identify in tyrants are also often identifiable in great statesmen. And to some extent, they overlap. And so the question is, when and where do they shade off, or at what point are they not the same? And so, for instance, Aristotle warns in Book 3 of the Politics that, the tyrant could come to you in the guise of the perfect monarch. The perfect monarch might himself have certain tyrannical sides, and you'd have to weigh that in the balance. And so the whole question of whether ambition is permissible or impermissible, and what are the licit reasons for political ambition as opposed to the illicit reasons for political ambition. This is something, for instance, that was very much alive in the minds of the American founders. People like Washington, Hamilton, they were constantly thinking about the contrast between being a Caesar or a Catiline as opposed to being a Cato. Washington had Addison's play Cato performed for his troops in camp to show them that this was about fighting on behalf of Republican liberty against Caesarian-style tyranny. So we don't have to go that far back in time, I think, to find a very lively awareness of this problem. It's really only in recent decades that it's become so very much occluded. It's really right there in our own backyard. Yes.
Hi. Oh, can I go? Hi.
Sorry.
I'm right over here.
Okay.
I'm Lisa, and I have a daughter in Jerusalem, so I've not been having a very good week. And having followed the ISIS, the progression in Iraq, and seeing how near the proximity, Jordan and Israel, I guess I don't have a set question, but perhaps what could you tell us about the progression, just what is going on now? And actually, it's interesting to hear discussion of manliness, because it seems Israel is about the only nation that seems to be standing up to defend itself and has really taken a bashing for that. So I guess I'll just leave it at this. Thank you.
Well, I think like most people, I'm not strictly speaking a foreign policy expert. I try to make myself an informed citizen as best I can. And like most people, my head is really spinning about the events in the aftermath of the outbreak of the Syrian war and the seemingly awful sets of choices that we face between supporting Assad, or at least not bringing about his ouster for fear of something worse, but then somehow strangely flirting with siding with Iran against ISIS, which I think is disastrous. I suppose in the absence, well, no, I'll be more frank. I frankly think that we should let them fight it out. I simply don't see any percentage in our investing blood and treasure on either side of that conflict. Let them have at it. In the past, the only thing, or one of the few things that united Shia and Sunni extremists was their joint hatred of Israel. And I don't see why we should encourage them to find common ground again. I suspect the Hamas attack, the kidnappings, by the way, might have been an attempt to change the subject and get Sunni and Shia back on board for the main item of destroying Israel. So my feeling now is we've got to save what we can. To me, above all, this means the open protection of an independent Kurdistan. Much as I admire George W. Bush and an unrepentant supporter of his invasion and toppling of Saddam Hussein, I always thought that the fetish about a so-called unified Iraq prevented Bush from taking credit for one of the few tangible good consequences of that war, which was the establishment of Kurdistan. Kurdistan is a society that is dying to be friendlier with us. They do not have Sharia law, and I think that we really need to, in a certain sense, draw the line and say, this is as far as this goes. Kurdistan is now under our protection, as is Jordan, as is Israel. And I also hope that some way can be found of constructing a path back to Egypt, who, again, I'm not comfortable supporting an unelected ruler, but they are dying to be America's ally again. And so for all of these reasons, I think that we need to, in a certain sense, draw a line in the sand, as Jimmy Carter did in the Gulf, and just say, this is as far as it goes, whatever else happens. This doesn't go any further. That's the best I can come up with for now. I'm still wrestling with this every day. Every day there's some new. I mean, I am struck by the typically one-sided coverage of what is happening in Israel. That the typical headline is, Israel unleashes savage pounding on the Gaza. Well, what about the Gaza unleashes savage pounding on Israel? There's a definite lopsidedness, I think, going on. Yes.
Alan Levine, American University. I want to thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you very much.
Many thoughts. I'm going to limit myself to two questions. One is, I think, a smaller political question, and then a very large philosophical question. And so the political question, you made, in making the distinction between authoritarian and totalitarian governments, what I heard you to say was that authoritarian governments can reform and totalitarian can't. And if that's what you were saying, or that strikes me as empirically false, that the Soviet Union and China have greatly reformed. And I mean, Mao and Stalin are the two greatest butchers of all time. I don't want to pretend otherwise. But in China today, there is a good amount of civil liberty for people to pursue money and all sorts of things, as long as they don't get involved in politics. And that's a huge reform. And similarly, in the Soviet Union, the difference between Stalin and Gorbachev was huge. So it seems, so I would just clarification about that.
It's a fair point, and it's a matter of shades of degree, and where you would mark off where these paradigms sort of take over and leave off. I suppose I might ask whether the Soviet Union of the Brezhnev era was not already declining into a kind of Ottoman-like shaky autocracy, where the ideological vigor of Stalinism was largely a spent force, with an odd last-minute comeback under Andropov, but then it seemed as if Gorbachev, in a sense, like other reforming autocrats, like Louis the 16th, in effect, tried to selectively democratize an authoritarian system, but then once the gates to that were open, they kind of roared in and swept it away. So yes, I would grant your point. China seems to me, the jury is still out there. It's become a kind of mercantilist oligarchy that still formally adheres to the collectivist ideology of communism. I don't know enough to know to what extent that's been wholly modified or not. It's interesting that, in contrast with what Gorbachev tried to do, the Chinese leadership seemed to rather miraculously make this leap and preserve the basic authority structure intact. So yes, I would grant your point.
Okay. Philosophical question. The difference between the reform tyrannies and the millenarian tyrannies has to do with the amount of ambition, I take it, of the tyrants. And what makes the millenarian, I'm going to play on that label, right, is something utopian, that they have aspirations that can't be brought about in this world, at least by human beings alone. And so what makes their ambitions so absurd and utopian is a failure to understand human nature properly. So my question has to do with your view of human nature. And we've heard both from David and you that the kind of Lockean view of human nature, in which we are all sort of freedom-loving and material-wanting, and that vision, which largely informs the American sort of cultural self-understanding, that view doesn't seem to be an adequate view of human nature. So what, can you just flesh out your view of human nature a little bit more?
Do you mean as to why people like Robespierre appeal to others based on human nature?
I guess what is it in human nature that makes tyranny always a possibility?
Yeah. Well, I think that apart from the ineradicability of tyrannical ambition itself from the human psyche, that tyrants often appeal to a kind of perverted idealism in their followers, especially the young, a desire for self-sacrifice in a great and noble cause. And it's interesting when you look at the career of major revolutionary figures, including Robespierre, Hitler. They were unusually young for politics. You know, Robespierre and Hitler were both major public figures in their early 30s. I mean, so for an old man's career, so to speak, these tyrannical leaders often appear in the guise of leaders of youth, and they appeal to the youth, and they present the shining vision of a better future in which people will overcome their selfishness and truly cooperate on behalf of the common good. As in Wordsworth's famous lines about being in Paris in the outbreak of the revolution, you know, that to be there was bliss, to be young was very heaven. So I think that desire for rising above self-interest in the pursuit or service of a noble cause is one that tyrannical movements exploit, you know, very readily. And that means that it is something always there. And I'm not sure that, you know, even a non-reductionist account of liberal democratic psychology could entirely inoculate it against that appeal. There may just be limits on how much a liberal democratic civic culture can completely stave off that kind of perverted idealism. You know, I have long argued that, you know, liberalism is not reducible to property rights. Property rights are one important, very tangible outcropping of a more fundamental liberty granted to us by democracy: freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of worship. As Hannah Arendt, no Tea Party fan, herself once argued, if property rights are violated by the state, that's a pretty good warning that your other rights are probably being violated as well. So there's a real sense in which you can defend the nobility of democratic culture, I believe. It's about more than material self-interest. But at the end of the day, I don't think you can entirely seal it off from these kinds of revolutionary blandishments. I think countries like America, you know, whose tradition in effect is democratic, are relatively immune to this kind of appeal. But in older societies where the modern revolution has been experienced as a kind of often traumatic, wrenching break with a past still distantly remembered, then I think the potential for this kind of perverted idealism is going to be very hard to get rid of entirely. Anything else?
Well, I'll ask the last question,
Okay.
perhaps. One interesting figure these days is Erdogan and what's his
Oh, yes, yes.
the movement behind him. They're based in Pennsylvania.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
What do you make of them, and where do they fit in this typology?
Erdogan seems to me on a completely amoral Machiavellian level, a fascinating player to watch. I think a part of Morsi's failure in Egypt was that he tried to become Erdogan too quickly, and I think he overplayed his hand. Especially, I suspect he tried too quickly to Islamicize the military, and they struck back. Erdogan has played a fascinatingly long game. He is like Putin in this regard, the capacity to plan by very slow stages, to probe and then see what happens, and then to fall back if need be, but then go forward. There have been lapses, like over the public square in Istanbul, where he seemed to just completely lose it and melt down, but that seems comparatively rare. So, he's a person to always watch, because he is, in a certain sense, an Islamist, and yet he's deeply pragmatic in other ways. He has very strong ties to small business. The merchant class, small business people, look on him as an ally in favor of free enterprise, ironically enough, against these vast quangos and huge corporations set up by the Kemalist regime. And he pays careful attention to that. So I think the jury is still out on him. I mean, there's the constant back and forth with Israel. It was very, relations were terrible under the flotilla. Recently, though, I gather they've been kind of like quietly coming back together a little bit over concern with ISIS and Russia. So, he is certainly in for the long haul, I would say. He's really, the way he managed to infiltrate and cashier the Kemalist military, I thought was a very impressive feat, just on a purely Machiavellian level. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks very much.
We have a few copies of Professor Newell's book for sale outside, if you're interested.